Many people want to become a UX designer nowadays, and who could blame them? It's a very well-paid job, it's actually quite creative, quite fulfilling, and it's not that difficult to learn. There's also not enough designers in the industry, so a lot of the companies are constantly looking for new additions to their teams. If you're considering to become a UX designer, great choice. It's a really good job and it's actually worth pursuing. And it's easier than you think. This video, which may turn into a series, is my way of explaining user experience design and our job and everything around it to people who had no previous experience with anything like this before. If your only experience is knowing what the U and the X stand for, that's perfect. You're gonna be right at home here. Let's begin. UX means user experience. A lot of the courses in the beginner classes start with telling you about some researching, ideating and whatever. The reality is that almost nobody mentions the very obvious thing at the very start, which is what you're gonna be doing. As a designer, you'll mostly be working on apps and websites. And of course there is some new frontiers coming like augmented reality, virtual reality, voice interfaces, but this is still a minority and it's gonna be still a minority for years to come. Instead of defining UX, let's define the design part first. When the word design is mentioned, people usually imagine somebody hunched over at a desk and drawing something with their hands on a piece of paper, and that discourages a lot of people because, well, many people can't draw. If you think that to be a great designer you need to be great at illustration, don't worry, that's not the truth. It's actually very far from the truth because design is not art. I'm a successful designer and this is how far my drawing skills actually go. You don't need to learn to draw. Of course it can help you sometimes, but it doesn't really matter. Most designers I know have no skills with like the typical visuals whatsoever. The design tools that you're gonna use are a little bit like Keynote or PowerPoint, which means that you'll be just creating shapes. You'll move objects, mostly rectangles, because most of the interfaces actually is made out of rectangles. You don't need to even draw the shapes yourself, because this is all in a library of shapes that you have predefined, and you kind of drag and drop them, change the color, change the size, change the position, and in most cases that's it. The idea is to use those rectangles, squares, some colors, some fonts, and some shadows, some effects, to create a representation of what an app or a website is going to look like. And this is the entire design part. Under the looks, there's this whole underlying idea of how it works. And this is also the job of a designer. And by how it works, I simply mean that if you place a button somewhere, you need to be aware that people are gonna be able to understand what the button does and are not gonna be confused by it. You can't really mention UX design without the research part. This is a little bit tricky because actually there is a whole other area of expertise or a whole other job called UX researcher. To be a designer, you also need to know the very basics of research. You need research to understand what you need to design and how. You can design for what you think you want, but it might not be what other people want and the app might not be successful. So the goal of researching and then placing the rectangles in the right spot is to solve a problem of your users. So what kind of a problem can it be? Here is an example. Let's say you're making an app to book hotel rooms. The problem is how to easily and quickly find the right room and book it. And your task here is to make it as easy and as fun as possible. So let's say you created your first design of a hotel booking app. And obviously, usually the first version is not that great because, well, you had to assume some things. And even if you did the initial research, there are still some things that could get out of control. That's where the testing comes in. This is the reason why both designers and researchers constantly check, and it's called iterating, which basically means they're doing little bits of work over time, over and over again, slightly improving the product. They test and they find out that there's like one little minor issue that people get confused by, so they figure out a way to fix that, they deliver it to the users and they see what happens. And if the users now don't have that problem, then we can focus on a different problem, but we still need to be checking everything all the time. This is the whole premise of user experience design. You design, you test, and then you change little things to make it better. It's basically what this whole industry is all about, because there is always something to improve. So to say say it in other words, you place some rectangles in some right places, you add some buttons and some text that explains things, and then you give it to the people to play around with, and once they are able to accomplish the task, that's good. If they're not able to accomplish the task, so in this instance, if they're trying to book a room and most people fail at this, then you need to figure out why and then make those adjustments to the product to actually make it possible for them. Easy. Okay, but how do I know what works? Well, we've all been using apps and websites for quite a long time. For many of us, it's been 15 to 20 years of using digital products. So in a way, we're all designers because we already know what works, we already know what's frustrating us, we already know what kind of concepts and ideas for booking a hotel room are good and are bad. And of course, it doesn't mean that we need to just copy everything that everybody else has done before, but it means that we have a very solid foundation to start on. So before you do any courses or any classes, just take some apps and websites that you use normally and try to evaluate them. Especially if they're good, try to figure out why this is easy to use for me, or why is something frustrating or annoying and why I don't really like using it. In many cases, it's just logic. You're gonna use logic to evaluate what works and what doesn't, and then you're gonna use research to validate that with real people. Instagram or YouTube are all a series of text, buttons and some images. That should give you a good idea of how to actually lay out these things for specific scenarios. There's just so much collective knowledge out there that you don't really need to ever design anything completely from scratch. There are those patterns and good practices, like the checkout button or the shopping cart is usually in the top right corner of the screen for most products because this is where people expect it to be. So a lot of the design process and the actual work can be quite repetitive because you can't innovate in terms of just coming up with something completely out there and crazy because people are not gonna be able to use it. In most cases, playing it safe and then doing a very nice visual representation of those things, so basically nice looking buttons, is gonna be more successful than coming up with a checkout process on the bottom left corner of the screen, because most people are simply gonna miss it there. Okay, how to learn UX? I would suggest to start with the cheapest possible one that you can find, because it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of money and then figure out that it's not for you after all. Recently, Google has released their own UX course for beginners, and while it does have quite a lot of little problems, it's actually quite good. I made a detailed review of this course on my channel here. Hey friends, so I've been asked this question a lot. Mike, can you recommend a good UX course for beginners? And up until now, I could only say that not really. The good thing is that the very first part of the Google UX course, which is the foundations, is completely free. So you don't really need to pay anything to actually learn the total basics and understand whether it's for you or not. There is a subset of UX design, which basically means a part of UX design, called UI design. And UI design is user interface design, which means that you're gonna be designing what you see. In UX design, you can sketch a concept of something and just say, we'll have a button here. Then in the UI design phase, we decide we want that button to be red. Then let's round the corners a little bit. That's too much. A little bit less. Perfect. Now let's add a shadow. Let's pick a font. Oh no, not this one. Okay, that's better. This is UI design. How things look. How things look is actually quite important because over the years we've gotten used to highly polished products from companies, and if an app or a website looks bad, we actually trust it less. To gain the trust of your users and to actually help them enjoy the experience, you need a great UI design. And of course, this can also be learned. It's not that difficult. While the Google UX course is actually quite good for the foundational knowledge and some of the research knowledge, it's not that great in terms of the UI design. If you want to play around with UI design, I have written a book that's probably the largest book on UI design in the world, and you can get 50 pages from that book completely free from the website of the book by just signing up to the newsletter. And those 50 pages are all about buttons. So you need to be able to understand how to make a nice looking button with like all of the different bits and pieces that you need to know about buttons, like outlines, shadows, proper font positioning in the button and everything else. And if you already started your UX journey, I also made 2 UI courses that are very highly praised by the people who are taking them, and thousands of designers already improved their skills using those courses. So this is just a little bit of an advertisement here, but don't worry, you can learn all of this on your own without paying a dime as well. It just takes a little bit longer. The goal of this series is to talk about UX with like the simplest possible language, and not to use those crazy words that they use all the time. I think some of the senior UX designers actually are a little bit gatekeeping, which means that they don't really want too many new designers in the field because that will actually take their jobs. I'm not like that. I want as many designers as possible, and I want everybody to have a great career. And this job is actually really easy, really well paid. You can get an amazing value for your time. The only thing that you're gonna need is a lot of ambition and dedication, because it does require you to actually practice quite a lot, especially the UI design part. That means that you'll have to be actually spending some time every single day for a couple of months. But after you do it, it's all fame and glory and a lot of cash. Just do it.